In this section, we are going to look at how trauma impacts the brain. So to start off with, we are going to define trauma. So go ahead and take a minute to read the information on the screen. So there are 3 E's that are associated with trauma. So individual trauma results from an event or a series of events or set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual as physically and or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and or physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So all 3 of these are part of trauma, and they're all present inside of traumatic experiences. So I want everyone to just take a minute to think about a traumatic experience that you had. So when I'm saying traumatic, it doesn't need to be something super serious. You could think even just a stressful situation. But I want you to think about it and to try and recall different senses that you experienced at that point in time. So maybe a sound that you remember, or a smell, or something you tasted. Emotion is attached to the memories that we have, and that's part of what plays into making things so traumatic when we think about them later on. So trauma comes in many different forms. It can be physical, cognitive, affective, or spiritual, and it can be experienced by an individual or a group. However, it is a very individualized experience in that every person is going to experience an event in a different way. So as a group, we here at Project Hope could have a fire in the building tomorrow, and all of us are present when the building is on fire. All of us experience that same event, but each one of us are going to walk away with a different sort of interpretation about what happened. So what is important to remember about trauma is it's the response to the event that creates the trauma, not the event itself. So that same event that one individual experiences is going to impact them differently than the other person, or another person, that experiences that same event. And this all has to do with neurobiology and background history, past experiences. All of that are going to play into how we're experiencing trauma. So go ahead and read the information up on the screen. So common responses to violence, which we will get into later on in the presentation, but things like freeze response, traumatic memories, and post-trauma behaviors are all rooted in neurobiology. So we are going to spend just a little bit of time in this section kind of talking about the brain and how the brain influences our perception of events. So the brain is the central stress organizer and interpreter of what is stressful and determines our behaviors and psychological responses to that stimuli. So prolonged exposure to trauma will actually lead to elevated levels of various chemicals inside of the brain, which can result in impaired cognition as well as emotional or behavioral regulation issues, and in some cases even autoimmune disorders. So now we're going to briefly look at the limbic system and trauma. If you've had any sort of biology or psychology classes where you studied the brain, please keep in mind that this is going to be a very simplistic overview. So by studying how the brain works, we can better understand how people survive different traumatic events. The limbic system, which is what we're going to look at now, is important to learn about. It has control over feelings as well as actions, and it also processes our memories. So it has a lot of control over our kind of interpretation of events that have occurred. So we're going to look at the different parts of the brain. You can see them in the picture here, and then a brief sort of summary to the left of the picture. So starting with the frontal lobe, this is considered our emotional control center as well as home to our personality. This lobe is involved in motor function, problem solving, spontaneity, memory, language, initiation, judgment, impulse control, as well as any social and sexual behaviors. So for individuals that have a history of trauma, when they're faced with a new traumatic experience, their frontal lobe actually, for lack of a better term, shuts off. So this leaves them in a state of reacting to a situation rather than sort of processing it through in the way they might normally. So for these individuals that have that history of traumatic experience, it can take up to 2 days for that frontal lobe to re-engage. So if we look on the flip side at individuals that have little to no history of traumatic experiences, when they're faced with something traumatic, that frontal lobe may still shut off, but it's only going to do it for about 20 minutes. So that's a pretty significant difference. 20 minutes for someone who's had little to no traumatic experience in the past, to 2 days for an individual who has a lot of history with traumatic experiences. Next, we're going to take a look at the thalamus. So the thalamus is involved in sensory perception as well as regulation of motor functions and long-term memory. It is also responsible for helping to regulate different hormones and emotional and physical reactions to situations, including emotional stress or trauma. Our hippocampus is where learning and verbal emotional memory are taking place. It is part of the temporal lobe that sends and receives input from the amygdala as well as the cortex. Your amygdala stores memories of fearful experiences. It is responsible for regulating safety, heart rate, and blood pressure. It also monitors all incoming stimuli for anything threatening and activates the fight, flight, or freeze response. Your hypothalamus assists the thalamus with regulating different hormones as well as emotional and physical reactions to situations. And our olfactory bulb is responsible for transmitting smell information from the nose to the brain, but it also receives information from other areas of the brain. So again, super basic overview, but that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of how the different parts of your brain play into memory and fearful situations. So next we're going to take a look at the prefrontal cortex. So below in the comments box you will have a video link. So please go ahead and click on that and watch it, and when you're finished you can come back to this presentation. All right, welcome back. So I just want to reiterate that this is the part of the brain that makes us human. Under normal conditions, the prefrontal cortex allows us to focus our attention where we choose and to do what we choose, as long as that's consistent with our goals and values. And it also allows us to do that deliberately. Okay, so in traumatic and high stress situations, there's a loss of that prefrontal regulation. It can become impaired or even shut down, so most of the brain's reactions happen automatically and outside of our awareness. The brain resorts to something called bottom-up attention. Essentially, our attention is captured by anything that's perceived as dangerous, threatening, or necessary for survival. There is a link on this in the comment box below, on the fight, flight, or freeze response. So go ahead and pause this video and watch the one below. Okay. So the amygdala, if you recall from up above, is kind of considered to be the fear center of the brain. Now, just to reiterate, there are a lot of different areas of the brain that play into fear, but the amygdala has a big role to play. So there is a video in the comments box below. Go ahead and take a moment to watch that and then come back to the presentation. So the fear center, one of the most important regions of the brain during a traumatic event, has the most central and powerful role in coordinating the brain's response during traumatic experiences. All right, we have another video here, so clicking in the comments box below. Please pay attention to the timing on the video. We're asking you to stop it around 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So go ahead and click the link and watch the video. And there is a question on the quiz in regards to the video. So now we're going to look at how trauma affects memories. So traumatic memories tend to be implicit rather than explicit. So simply put, implicit memories are nonverbal and emotional, whereas explicit are a chronological narrative. Survivors of relationship violence or sexual assault may have memories that are difficult to verbalize and are not expressed in a clear and chronological order. Traumatic memories occur in flashbacks or are isolated and fragmented. And this is relevant in the way that survivors recall the assault. So they're going to remember different pieces at different times. They're going to put things in different order, and you're going to pick up on this very quick, especially during those initial first-time meetings for clients. So when they come in to do their intake and they're telling you their story, oftentimes as an advocate, it can be extremely difficult to track what happened when. Everything can be fairly jumbled together. They may be mixing in stories from past things in with stuff that happened more recently. And so it can be complicated to sort of sit there and listen and try to process what they're saying. So if you think about an individual who was sexually assaulted, for example, going to make a report right after the assault to law enforcement or going over to the hospital, their recollection of what happened is most likely going to be pretty jumbled. And so the story that they may be telling to an officer or a nurse, whoever's listening to them, it may be all over the place. They may be missing information or adding in information that is considered by others to not be important. So it can really impact the way that listener is perceiving the story. If a survivor is telling their story to somebody who's not trained, who is not empathetic to what they experienced, that listener might start to doubt the survivor's story because it doesn't make sense to them. And that can be really disheartening and difficult for a survivor because they're feeling like they're not believed, that people don't believe what they're being told. So I have another analogy to kind of illustrate this for you. So I want you to imagine that you're writing down a story in linear form on multiple sticky notes. The first event on the first sticky note and what happened next on the following sticky note, and so on. Then place the notes randomly around the office, completely scattered and all over the place. Now try to read the story and piece it together. So this is what many survivors go through when trying to remember their story and when they're trying to share what happened to them with someone else. So there are a lot of factors that can influence trauma. So just to reiterate, remember that every survivor is going to experience the trauma of violence in a different way. Acknowledging that many factors contribute to this experience is critical to providing services through a trauma-informed lens, focusing on the specific individualized needs of each survivor. A variety of factors that may happen prior, during, or after the traumatic event can contribute to the way an individual reacts to that event. So starting at that inner circle there, we've got our pre-trauma factors. So these are things that are occurring prior to that traumatic experience. So things like education, work status, gender, age, culture, physical health, past history of trauma. And then the next ring is our peri-trauma factors. So these are things that occur during the trauma, the severity of the trauma, the nature of the trauma, the repetition of the trauma. And then that final ring is our post-trauma factors. So these are things that are occurring after a traumatic situation. So the response by medical professionals, law enforcement, the fear of the situation going public, fear of prejudicial treatment of the abuser, a family support system, the response that a survivor is receiving when they tell their story, fear of family fracture, and overall social support. So as an advocate, knowing these factors can help you better understand the context and where the survivor is and where they're coming from. So there is a handout that should have been included called Immediate and Delayed Reaction to Trauma. So you're going to kind of keep that in mind as we're going through the rest of this presentation. So the next few slides are just going to take a look at the impact of trauma on the different sort of systems for the body. So we're going to start by looking at the neurological impact. So take a minute to read the information up on the screen. Now we're going to take a look at the social impact of trauma. So take a minute to read the information up on the screen. And now some psychological impacts of trauma. So you can take a look at the pictures that are up on the screen right now. The first one is showing the difference between a normal brain and a brain of someone suffering from PTSD. And then the bottom picture is looking at brain networks in a normal brain and then a stressed out brain. So essentially these pictures are just reiterating the idea that a stressed out brain cannot effectively respond, learn, or process information. So really the kind of take-home points from this slide are always keeping in mind the interactions that you're having with the clients that we serve here at Project Hope. So remember that you're most likely going to have to repeat information a lot of times. And this can even be simple information. Our clients are coming to us frequently in a state of crisis. So they're not going to remember things like the name of the person that they talked to. Even if they've met with that advocate over and over again, they're probably not likely to remember that person's name. They may not remember the services that we provide here, so you may have to tell them several times what services Project Hope can offer them. If you give them a referral somewhere, they may not remember that information. You may have to give it to them more than once. So being patient with them, helping them by writing things down, not just giving them a lot of verbal information and expecting them to remember it. Sometimes as an advocate, one of the best things you can do is just try to help that person stay organized. So we've done this by helping our clients keep track of their paperwork, giving them a folder so that they can keep track of all of their important documents in one spot. Helping them take notes. Maybe they have a court hearing and we attend the hearing with them and we take notes. Or help debrief afterwards. We can prep them before they go into those meetings by helping them list out questions that they have or things that they want to make sure that they discuss. So going out of your way just to try to make this as easy as possible for them, and then not getting frustrated if you're having to give the same thing over and over again. Be patient, be empathetic to their situation. So stress and trauma are two different things. So some of our clients are experiencing traumatic symptoms, but some of the other ones may just be experiencing stressful situations. They're not at the same level, so this slide is just giving you an example of the difference between the two. So a stressful situation is something that's considered to be difficult, but there is still a feeling of control. So once I do X, Y, or Z, it's going to calm down. There's also some respite. So they're able to distract or take time out. So I have this big project due for class, but this weekend I'm going to take a hike and just take a step away and get a little bit of a break. As far as the feelings, inside of that situation, the intensity level is not the same. So I'm feeling sad about what happened. Whereas for trauma situations, the situation is potentially life-threatening, and there's a loss of control and no end in sight. So there's not a formula I can follow to put an end to it. There is no way to contain the situation. So inside of that stressful one, again, taking a hike will give me a break, a mental break from what's going on. In these trauma situations, there's not really a way for that individual to take that mental break. And then the intensity of the feeling, so rather than just feeling sad, they're feeling a deep depression. So trauma is experienced at a much more extreme level. Both stress and trauma can be manifested in a person after a triggering event. It is important to notice the difference as well as the correlation between the two. Also, many of the impacts that are discussed in this slide are symptoms of acute stress disorder or PTSD. So acute stress disorder is an anxiety disorder with symptoms similar to those seen in PTSD, and more likely have feelings of not knowing where they are, being outside of their body. One of the main differences is that a PTSD diagnosis cannot be given until symptoms have been present for an individual for longer than a month. Approximately 6 to 33% of people who experience a traumatic event develop acute stress disorder. This rate varies based on the nature of the traumatic situation. ASD typically occurs within 1 month of a traumatic event. It lasts at least 3 days and can persist for up to 1 month. People with ASD are very likely to get PTSD. They have found that over 80% of people with ASD have PTSD 6 months later. So it's definitely something that can evolve. So stress can evolve into that more severe trauma experience. Okay, so now we're going to take a little bit of time to look at the ACE study. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So any trauma that occurs from birth up to age 25 has the potential to disrupt the typical neurodevelopmental processes and contribute to long-lasting consequences for an individual. So the ACE study looks at trauma over the lifespan. The data reveals staggering proof of the health, social, and economic risks that result from childhood trauma. So there is a video in the comment box below that talks a little bit more about the ACE study. So go ahead and click on that at this time. Okay, so the ACE study, just to wrap it back up, shows how much trauma can clearly affect people and how much of an impact it actually has. This is a clear example of why knowing the trauma can help professionals engage with the individuals that are experiencing it. So now we're going to take a look at the fight or flight response. So I'm sure that most of you have heard of this. However, we're going to take a moment to point out that it's actually misleading. So we evolved to freeze and then flee. The fight portion is very uncommon. However, people have this idea that if you're in this experience, if you're in this traumatic experience, that if you're not fighting, you're weak, you're maybe not manly enough, whatever it happens to be at that time. So tonic immobility, you'll see that up on the screen. This is a temporary state of motor inhibition that's believed to be a response to situations involving extreme fear. Signs of a freeze reaction can include a brief response when a victim perceives a danger, being highly alert, having a heightened attention state that is receptive to a wide array of information in the external environment, not moving because that could provoke or worsen an attack, and because that would absorb brain resources that initially need to be focused on assessing the situation. And then readiness to suddenly burst into action. If fighting occurs, it's typically only in the service of fleeing. So you freeze first, your brain is assessing the situation, and then the next reaction is for you to flee the situation. If an individual engages in fighting prior to fleeing, then it's not fighting to win, it's fighting to get out. So they're only doing it because it's part of them getting away from what's happening. So this is important to understand because most victims are going to be ashamed if they did not fight back. Go ahead and take a minute to read the quote up on the screen. Okay, so the next several slides, or I should say the last several slides, are giving you various scenarios. So here's how you're going to do this. You're going to read through each scenario, and then you're going to go over to the quiz and complete the questions that are listed in the scenario. Each one is talking about different aspects of things that we covered in previous slides. So if you do need to review, then you can go back to earlier slides in the presentation. But please answer thoroughly, just with as much information as you can. So this is scenario 1. If you need more time, you are also welcome to pause the video so you can read the scenario. This is our final scenario, so go ahead and take a minute to read it and then answer the questions on the quiz. We're going to move on to the last slide. If you need more time, go ahead and pause the video. So to sum up this section, the survivors that we work with are most likely not going to be interested in discussing the neurobiological aspects of trauma. But the whole purpose of this section is really just to reiterate it for you as their advocate. It's going to be helpful for you to understand that they're jumbled stories, they're going back and forth, or adding information later on. It doesn't mean that they're lying. It doesn't mean that they're making things up. So being a good advocate for them to others, if you hear or become aware of any sort of victim blaming behaviors, but also just reassuring the client, the survivor, that their responses are natural. And it's okay, and that there's nothing wrong with them. They didn't do anything wrong because they didn't act in the way they thought they should have. So thank you so much for taking the time to view this section. Please make sure that you answer all of the questions on the quiz.